Hello, everybody. Welcome to, I guess, last week's um, discussion lecture, um, which is part one of this week's discussion. Again, I am still at the very tail end of this whole flu thing that I've had, so I'll be back on track next week for sure. Um, but I wanted to get started by discussing kind of the foundations of game analysis, what we're going to be using to figure out when we look at a game, what makes a game good or bad, why do the mechanics or the story or um, the visuals work in certain games versus not in other games. It's kind of a general kind of umbrella look at everything. How do you get games how you hit games that vary, and I don't use IGN reviews very often in determining whether or not um, I think a game is quality or not. But this example of the kind of dichotomy between a game like The Day Before, which is, if you don't know about this game, is a total scam that didn't end up being a game, um, versus how you get something like Legend of Zelda, which uh, Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild both are pretty close examples to kind of like the perfect package game, at least within their genres. Um, so we're going to discuss a little bit about how we can derive information from those um, points, whether it is inside of reviews, what reviews are, versus analysis and criticisms and um, more actionable data. So I guess we should start. And I want to apologize if there's a lot of cuts in this video. Again, I'm the last thing I seem to be having in this sickness is coughing a lot, so I'll probably be cutting quite a bit. But um, let's see if we can get through this slide before I do that. What is game analysis? What are we trying to do? Um, Simply, it is the analysis, evaluation, and interpretation of video games based off of their mechanics, their narrative, or their artistic value. Um, we kind of look at this as like why what parts of games work versus what parts don't, why do they work, why do they not, and um, how can we improve upon them. um, this is a little bit different from in the previous slide, the IGN reviews and kind of their breakdowns for reviews versus actionable criticism, things that we um, want to take to heart in the industry versus things that uh, we don't want to let bother us or enforce our design methods, because they can definitely do that when you get a good review on something or a bad review on something. We have to remember that reviews are providing an assessment of a game's quality to the consumer, and they're usually designed to tell consumers whether or not they want to play your game. They're very important. You want to have good reviews on your games, but uh, you, as a developer, want to get more than I like how pretty the graphics are, or the combat is really engaging, or the soundtrack is really good. We want actionable things such as the game balance is off. This class is more powerful than this class. This boss is too difficult to beat. This mechanic is broken. Things like that. Um, and that type of criticism lets us inspect things like why we're making these decisions, our design choices, the themes, or um, the messages we're trying to get across. Okay, so whether or not it is a game review by a journalist or a play test, feedback from a gameplay session, or something from your QA, or something from industry leaders themselves, what are the roles of criticism? What are we trying to achieve? Um, from a consumer standpoint, we are trying to uh, reviews and things like that are trying to inform players whether or not they are making correct purchasing decisions, what they can expect from playing a game, whether or not the gameplay is good or there are issues, things like that. Um, on the opposite end of that, we are trying to influence our development cycle, our way to provide feedback that can better the end result of our game. This the example for the image that I'm using here is, I think, kind of might be the most relevant one in recent memory, where the feedback that was received from early trailers of the Sonic movie on how ugly Sonic was changed his design completely, and whether or not you prescribe to the conspiracy theories that was always going to be the case or whatever, it was an effective marketing tool and definitely created a better experience in the Sonic movie, as a result. Um, and the final thing that we try to do, or that criticism tries to do, is to shape discourse around um, whatever the piece of art is. Um, whether it's a way to start a discussion on the meaning behind something, if there is a greater um, a deeper artistic goal behind a piece of media, or whether it's just trying to figure out the plan for the game um, as it was designed. So, how do we go about performing this analysis? What are the different methods? What are the different approaches to um, making informed uh, dissections of our games, other games, and how we use that to better our own design or development cycles? So, there are a couple of different ways, or a couple of different definitions of ways that analysis can be done. What you're looking at specifically, how you are comparing it to other things, and what the importance of the data that you receive as feedback from these different criticisms can show you. So formal analysis, which is looking at technical systems, mechanics, uh, general gameplay ideas, whether or not those elements are effective at doing what you want them to do, whether they're fun or engaging, or whether they are useful in developing uh, when integrated with the narrative. Um, uh, that mechanics, furthering narrative, explaining mechanics. That's called a ludonarrative analysis, which will uh, bridge that formal to narrative um, connection between ways that you're looking at a game. So if you're playing a game and you're enjoying its story, and part of the story is that the main character has a certain power, or goes about things in a certain way that can be, or has a certain weakness, and that translates into the gameplay itself, that can be considered a ludonarrative analysis. Speaking of narrative, we also want to analyze how the narrative affects the player, whether the story itself is engaging, whether it is invoking emotions that you want to invoke in the audience, whether character development whether character development is actually present, whether the plot makes sense or is too complicated or is too simple. All of these things can help us decide how we want to tell our story, and how much importance we want to put around the story itself. Some games do completely fine without a very deep narrative basis at all. Mario games have been doing this for decades with a very similar narrative through line of Bowser captures Princess, Mario saves Princess, defeats Bowser. Um, there are a couple of different flavors of that, especially when you get into the 3D Mario games. Between we've got to collect the stars in Mario 64, or the oh gosh, what are they called? The little star things in Galaxy, or if you're trying to clean up sections of your island paradise thing in Super Mario Sunshine. You know, the mechanics behind the narrative through line are there, but at the end of the day, it's stop Bowser, save Princess, save Mushroom Kingdom, or I guess in Galaxy's case, you know, the galaxy. And then our next point is contextual analysis, which is looking at the game through a lens of outside context. So your cultural, historical, social context, um, whether or not what you're trying to do through creating your game um, is to have a educational or otherwise informative aspect to it, such as if you're trying to make light or bring light to a certain social struggle or a certain group of people that are in one way or another affected by um, the result of your game, whether or not this has a cultural significance. If you're creating a game that's specifically around a specific a um, a subset of a culture, and you want to better portray that culture within your gameplay, within the narrative or the audio or the actual mechanics of the game. Um, this contextually, you are uh, wanting to make sure that that gets seen by your audience. Um, and another way that we can look at our analyses is through comparative analysis, which is simply looking at one game versus another, determining each game's features, their strengths and weaknesses, what things one does better than the other versus what different things one can do or add to. This is especially useful in specific genre comparisons, or if you are um, mechanically creating a game that is similar to another game and want to kind of see what things that game the game you are comparing your work to does well versus what they do not so well. Okay, lost. Forgot these recordings cut off every 15 minutes. Okay, comparative analysis. So we were discussing kind of a good example of that would be something similar to if you were making um, uh, a pet capturing game similar to Pokemon, and you wanted to compare what Pokemon does well versus other similar pet collecting games like Digimon Stories or Digimon Cyber Sleuth being the most recent Digimon Stories game. Um, and you want to compare those two, that it would be comparative analysis, determining what each of those games does well versus what they don't, what they do poorly, and which game does what better. Um, a simple example of that. So next, we're going to discuss kind of the ways that our criticism are that our criticism is portrayed to the critici, the person which is receiving our criticism. Um, so when we're analyzing kind of the way that a game works, its features, different design choices, ways that mechanics and systems and stuff like that, while describing what works and what doesn't. That's called descriptive criticism. We are not informing with any kind of um, influence as to whether or not that criticism uh, can be improved upon. Just saying straight the facts of, this this part was not fun. This part was not working properly. There were bugs in it. There were textural problems in the models, or lighting was messed up. Things like that. That's descriptive criticism versus prescriptive criticism, which is when we try to suggest improvements, or um, kind of give our own attempt at design um, to the uh, to the recipient. Now um, we are trying to, as when we do these analyses, keep the prescriptive criticism for things when it's asked for, or specifically to our own work. And we want to do that because it is more helpful when somebody actually wants it, and versus if they are just looking for more of a descriptive feedback. Um, so when we're talking to, say, we're doing a playtest, a beta playtest of a game, and we ask for players' feedback, and they say something like, this boss encounter wasn't balanced properly. Um, it was very difficult, and it felt like it should be less difficult. If they just stop at saying like it was difficult, um, or if they continue, and we as the developers want to follow up and say, okay, so what made it too difficult? Did it have too much HP? Do you think that it did too much damage? Its attacks were hard to recognize, things like that. We are asking for prescriptive criticism. We're asking for suggestions for things that um, the player thinks could improve upon what we're working on. So again, we want to kind of keep descriptive criticism to things that are kind of quantifiably able to be explained, versus prescriptive, where we want to form an opinion on how we think that something could be better. Which actually leads directly into our next point, which is objectivity versus subjectivity. So the simple definitions for objective versus subjective is objective things are demonstrable um, without without our own opinions able to be shown as to whether or not they are good or bad. So they focus on empirical data, measurable qualities, and demonstrable facts about whatever the game is that um, we are analyzing. So if you look at an RPG and you say that this boss or this monster does too much damage, and you can back that up with data showing that it's doing 20% more damage than everything else of the similar level or something like that. Those are things that are objective and can be easily proven as to whether or not they are true, versus subjective criticism, which is something that um, we apply more opinion on. Whether or not something is fun, whether or not a song sounds good, or whether or not a color palette works in a zone. These are things that are more open to interpretation, and that feedback is very important, but also um, less actionable because you can't. I guess the term, the phrase, like, you can't please everyone all the time. Um, at a certain point, you have to make decisions on your design as to whether or not a game, or a an aspect of a game is going to make one group happy versus another group. You have to make those decisions at some point because you can't make everyone happy all the time. So in aspects of, especially in artistic interpretation, if you're not getting the response that you were expecting to get with a um, artistic aspect of your game, like say soundtrack, if that's a global belief, something that you see from a vast majority of your feedback, then there may be something about the way you're approaching it that is incorrect, and you should probably relook at that and better evaluate that. Maybe change the style of music or whatever you're working on. But if one or two people are saying that they didn't like a song in your soundtrack, well, that's fine. They can have that opinion, but a lot of other people do enjoy it, and you have to make the decision of who you want to make, you know, who you want to target that music for, and whether or not it coincides with your artistic vision for whatever the game is that you're making. And so you need to kind of create this well-rounded perspective between subjective and objective criticism, um, when you are criticizing uh, a game or any piece of media. You need to make sure that both points are being represented faithfully. So um, when you talk about gameplay experiences and whether or not something works versus whether or not something is too difficult or too easy, or whether it does actually objectively work mechanically, uh, you need to make sure that feedback is given, as well as feedback like, I thought that this section was a lot of fun, or I didn't enjoy the color palette in this section, things like that. Those are there's a fine balance there when you are analyzing kind of what is effective and what is ineffective, based off of your own personal opinions. So what do we do with this as designers? How do we collect this feedback, collect this criticism, analyze it, and implement it into our designs? This is kind of the meat of what we as designers do when we collect feedback. When we analyze other people's other people's games, if when in this class when we are analyzing other games, whether or not they're effective or ineffective uh, assets, we can't necessarily give this feedback directly to other developers. But if a designer like us, wants to take feedback like that and implement it into their own design, there are methods to do that. I've talked about it a little bit before. It's in video gaming, you have alpha, beta playtesting. A lot of times in video gaming, difference between an alpha or a beta playtest will be whether or not you're looking at a specific system, um, a specific mechanic, versus kind of a wide combination of systems or mechanics. So an alpha playtest would be before a game's alpha version is complete. You want to make sure that, like, if it's an online game, that you're stress testing your servers and you can have enough people on your server at one time. There's not a lot of lag, things like that. Whereas if you're in a beta playtest, you're looking at, like, okay, so now we have all these people in this server and the mechanics seem to be working. Can we are we giving the correct gameplay experience for say a dungeon or a raid or a boss fight, or a certain event, things like that. Um, Either way, whether it's an alpha, a beta, or any other kind of open or closed playtest, that's what they're called. If you have taken my there we go. If you've taken my game design on paper course last semester, then you'll be aware of the iterative design method, and kind of how we use it to in paper game design. You use it to iterate upon uh, different mechanics or portions of a game to create a better experience. Same thing in video game design. So if we were to do an alpha or a beta play test and we were looking to create a or we're looking to determine whether or not a mechanic works, or whether or not part of a game is balanced, whether or not combat is balanced, certain characters or classes are balanced, certain bosses, um, we'd put we'd find volunteers who want to play the game and tell us, give us their feedback on it, and test that out. And at the end of a playtesting session, we would receive feedback from the players. We would receive feedback from our own developers, where a lot of the empirical data comes from that, where you'll get things like, if we're doing an alpha and we're looking for a stress test on a server, then we would get, like, oh, okay, so how many users were online at one time? What was the where were we capping our bandwidth versus where were slowdowns happening, were people losing connection, stuff like that. That's stuff that we can look at on the back end. We don't necessarily get that from the players, but we can also get things from players, such as combat mechanics, scoring, and um, whether or not loot drops properly. Things like that are all things that we can get back from player feedback, and then we can jump in and implement that into our future versions of our build. So first step in iterative design is to get playtesting and feedback, have people try out your game, collect their feedback, and then second step is to implement that feedback back into a game, and then you'll restart the process again. So in terms of what things do we implement, what feedback do we implement, in terms of getting that feedback, we will gather the data, the empirical stuff we'll get through numbers and tables and graphs and things like that. The subjective feedback we'll receive and go through and decide whether or not certain mechanics or certain features in a game actually work or don't work, and what we should change. Send that back to the design and development teams, fix those issues, fix bugs, change, add mechanics, things like that, create a new build of the game, and then do it again. And this is why you'll have certain okay, lost another train of thought there by the 15-minute cutoff on this recording. um I could talk about the iterative design stuff forever, but the basic gist of it is that we want to um collect as much feedback as possible, improve upon our design, get it back out there, and do that all over and over again until what we've come up with is a polished version of um, the game that we want to play or that we want to release. And criticism, the analysis that we create, the feedback that we can give in this process is very important to making sure that the end result is as good as it can be. of course, we need to kind of balance what positive and negative feedback. We want to we don't want to just sit there and complain about everything wrong with a game without being able to point at things that are that do work. And on the other hand, we don't want to spend an entire review lauding a game about how good it is without being able to look at certain aspects and see that there are flaws. No game is actually perfect. Um, there is an argument to be made for somebody feeling like a game is perfect to them, but there are issues in every game, um, and we need to be able to point them out. At the same time, even the worst games have some redeeming qualities that we need to be able to look at and be able to identify. Um, so, to kind of speed this end part a little along, um, we want to make sure that we keep a balance between identifying good qualities in the game versus bad qualities in the game, and how we uh, give that feedback while being constructive and not destructive on the way that we um, explain our analysis. So when you're reviewing or analyzing a game that is the worst thing that you've ever played, you need to be able to say like this is bad. This mechanic definitely doesn't work. It's absolutely horrible. But like here's why. Here's the issue, whether it's an objective or a subjective thing, where you can say like objectively speaking, this mechanic doesn't work because XYZ numbers are too high, too low, or whatever. Or subjectively, this feels really bad. You know, I do not jump high enough. I feel like I should be jumping higher. It just feels really bad that in a platforming game I feel like I have lead shoes. You have to kind of qualify why um, the feedback is one way or another. And a good way to do that is to provide evidence. This is especially useful for developers when discussing things with QA or discussing things with your playtesting groups, your alphas and betas and stuff. Like any amount of data, any amount of gameplay footage that can be used. Very rarely will you use actual literature, but if it's a historical issue or a consistency issue or a problem with the way things are written, whether it's grammar or spelling or whatever, that literature can be used to back that up. If you find out that somebody is incorrectly that has the incorrect timeline for when the American Revolution happened, well, you might be like, well, these history textbooks, it says this happened then, stuff like that. But mostly the data and the gameplay footage where you can actually show a developer, especially gameplay footage, where something went wrong, or this thing was really cool, or I want more of this, or this bug happened here. Especially in beta tests, you'll get it a lot where it's, do you have footage of this, or do you have a log of this? Data logs are also very important when dealing with quantitative feedback, where if you're saying that there's a lag issue, or that damage isn't right on a certain thing, or it's not calculating something correctly, those logs are your best friend to be able to figure out exactly why that's happening. So if you have this information, if you have this evidence, it's good to use it to further back up your claims, your issues, or your praises. So, and I believe, yes, that was the last of our slides. So I think I'm going to break this up, mostly because I feel incredibly out of breath still. I'm going to break this up and post the next part of the discussion or of the um, lecture tomorrow morning um, for this week's part of the syllabus, which is, as I bring this over here so we can look at it together, um, the game mechanics and systems, where we actually will be discussing kind of how you can analyze whether or not a game's actual systems of gameplay work well or not. Um, I'll get more in depth in that. It's a lot of math, but I'll be getting into more depth in that tomorrow morning. So please keep a lookout for that. And um, if you want to kind of do everything all at once, I understand. I'll post a thing with this today saying that. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you guys next time.